with that in mind, God works his purpose through the hearts of kings. If you want to know God's will, then pray, and he'll direct your paths. And Paul's admonition and encouragement to the Philippians here about what to think upon, and that God is going to provide, and he is going to have those things for you. He will strengthen you when you need that. Let's go now to the book of Esther. Esther's in the Old Testament. It's before the book of Psalms and Proverbs, so if you're there, that's kind of a big milestone. Go a little before that. Now, we studied Esther in children's ministry just a couple weeks ago. We spent 1 week in it, which if you see, Esther's 10 chapters. So we were taking parts of Esther and looking at that from a holistic view. When I was here in October, I said you should be doing two things. One is reading your Bible, just read through it. And the other is studying your Bible, is taking the time to dig into it. And so what we did in children's ministry a couple weeks ago with Esther is we read through much of it and we just studied a portion of that. So we spent a little bit of time. Now, on Sundays, coming up in just a few weeks, we're going to be spending a lot of time in Esther in children's ministry. It's like 6 or 7 weeks of just looking into Esther and seeing all that's in that book. It's really a blessing. It only comes around every probably 4 or 5 years in children's ministry. We go through the Bible, both on Thursdays and Sundays. So if we get them when they're 2 and potty trained, and we give them up when they're ready to go at 12 or 13, and they come up here, they should have been through the Bible in children's ministry probably about 4 or 5 times. And Esther, if you know the story, there's a celebration that the Jews to this day still celebrate called Purim that entails what happened here, and that's coming up just in a couple of weeks. Actually, I wrote it down here because I knew I'd forget. It's March 6th and 7th. So our tour in Israel is going to be in Jerusalem at the time, and I know they're looking forward to that. Jessa came over. My mom's a seamstress. She came over and she bought a dress, and my mom fitted it for her, and she was, beautiful young girl. She's going to be in Jerusalem having the time of her life on Purim, along with the group that's there. But Esther, I encourage you to read through it, I guess is my point, especially if you have kids, because they're going to be in that now for weeks, and you guys can have some great conversations with your kids about what they're learning in the book of Esther. And one of the things, there's some people, everybody has some opinion. You're going to find wackadoo opinions everywhere. And one of them is that the book of Esther really shouldn't be in the Bible because God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. And that's true. It's true. God's never mentioned. Prayer is never mentioned, although when you look at it, you can tell that's a big part of what's happening here. But let's read through it, and if you see me struggling a little bit, it's only because the light in my old eyes now are not cooperating so much, but I will do my best. Chapter 1, Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is the Ahasuerus that reigned from India unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne in his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes, the provinces being before him. And when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty, many days, even 180 days, so 180 days. So he spent half a year sort of having a big World's Fair, if you will. He had his kingdom all decked out so that he could show his majesty and power to all the kingdom and all of the rulers and the people of the kingdom, so that they could come and see all of this amazing wealth and power. And it was 180 days, I think, because, in those days, if you're talking from India to Ethiopia, that's a massive kingdom. So it's going to take a while to arranged to come and travel and spend time and all of that. So he's showing off, if you will, in his third year of his reign. Verse 5, and when the days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people which were present in Shushan and the palace, both great and small, for 7 days, in the court, in the garden of the king's palace, where were white and green and blue hangings fastened with cords, and fine linen, and purple and silver rings, and pillars of marble, and beds were of gold and silver upon the pavement, of red and blue and white and black marble, and they gave drink in vessels of gold, and the vessels were each diverse from one another, and the royal wine was in abundance according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of the house that they should do according to everyone's pleasure. And also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. So, we look at this and think, well, okay, so it's lots of colors and lots of things going on, but you have to imagine, back in those days, cloth was expensive, and colored cloth was even more expensive, and if you had dyes like blue and purple, those are incredibly expensive. Today we don't think about that because we have such advancement that clothing is cheap. We don't think anything of just going to Walmart and getting my socks come in bags. So a bag of socks and a t-shirt or something, right? I mean, we just go. And if the shirt is purple or teal or white, it doesn't affect the price at all. That's not how it was then. So he's showing off the fact that he has a lot of wealth, and all of the gold cups, every one distinctly different, right? So probably handmade and by artisans and things like that. So on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, so everybody's, they've been drinking for 7 days. So you tell me. He commanded a bunch of guys here, 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. So everybody's pretty well intoxicated. It's at the end. We need some grand finale. I know what we'll do. We'll get Queen Vashti to come. And she said no. Now, it doesn't say here, and where the Bible's silent or you have to kind of speculate, I want to make sure that when I'm teaching the kids, this is my speculation. This is what I think. That's not necessarily what I see in Scripture here, but it makes sense. I don't know why she didn't come. Was it that they were going to kind of parade her in a way that was demeaning, degrading? Don't know. Was she sick? Don't know. But there was some reason why she wouldn't or couldn't come. What we do know is that made the king really mad. And if you know anything about being intoxicated, your emotions kind of escape you. So you start to have more intense emotions. So I'm sure he was probably really mad because he's being told no. And if you know anything about these kings, they don't get told no. So this was a big thing for her to say no, but she did. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men, and we're going to see how wise they really were, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew and in judgment. And the next to him were a bunch of these guys whose name I can't pronounce. 7 princes of the Medes and the Persians, which saw the king's face and which sat first in the kingdom. So these are his closest advisors. These are his cadre of people that give him counsel. So one of the things that you want to have in your life is somebody who can give you wise counsel. But what is wise counsel? When you look back in the Bible, when Solomon died, Rehoboam was the next to come up, and the tribes came to him and said, "Look, your dad was great, but he really taxed us super high. Can you lower the taxes a little bit, and we will follow you?" And so he went to his own dad's councils, the older guys that had been around who had helped his dad rule the kingdom. I mean, and Solomon was the wisest guy around. He still had advisors, right? So he's got probably pretty wise advisors. And they said, yeah, do that. Lower the taxes, because everybody will love you, they'll follow you, and that's a wise thing to do. So he thought about that. Okay. Well, then he went to his buddies who were his age, no experience in worship or in leadership, and said, "I don't know, what should I do?" And they're like, "Oh, how dare they? You're the king, dude. You gotta show them who's boss. You gotta say, hey, man, you think it was bad under my dad? You just wait." I go into the surfer dude voice because that's what I think in my head. Sorry, it's probably why I'm in children's. I think in cartoons, and in my head I'm just seeing these friends around him, with long hair and surfer shorts, and going, "Oh man, that's wrong, dude. They should totally respect you." And so that's what he listened to. He listened to unwise counselors. They didn't know God. They weren't quoting scripture. They weren't seeking the Lord. They hadn't prayed about it. They had just given their own advice from lack of experience. But that's who he listened to. And you know the story that 10 tribes in the north said, "Okay, well, if that's where you're going to be, we're just going to go do our own thing." And the kingdom split. After that, there were 2 kingdoms. So here, the king is going to rely on his advisors, and the Bible says here they were wise advisors, but we'll see how wise they were. Maybe they were wise in their own eyes. Verse 15, "What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law, because she has not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains?" And Memucan answered and said before the princes, "Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, to all the people that are in all the provinces of the kingdom. For this deed of the queen will come abroad unto all the women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when it's reported. And King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought before him, and she didn't come. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which heard of this deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal command from him, and let there be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes that it not be altered, that Queen Vashti come no more before the king, and let the king give her royal estate to another that is better than she." So, what's the advice? Oh, can you imagine what all the women are going to do if they hear that she said no? We think you should, make a decree that they have to follow their husbands and their rulers, and she can't be queen anymore. "And the king's decree which he shall make shall be published throughout the empire, for it is great. And all the wives shall give their husbands honor, both great and small." So they did. Verse 22, they sent it out and they did all that. King's like, okay. All right. So what do we know about this decision? First of all, he did go to his wise counselors, but they didn't give him wise advice. And we're going to see this in a minute. But what was this decision based on? So when I was going through this, I'm like, these are decision points. This is decision point number 1. What was the basis of this decision? Alcohol and emotion. 2 things you should never base decisions on. Don't make a decision of any importance when you're inebriated. That's sort of obvious. But emotions are a horrible thing to base a decision on. And what was the emotions? Number one, anger and fear. These guys were afraid that this one act by the queen, in some circumstance that was obviously unusual, was going to get around, and they were going to lose control. They were going to lose their status. They were going to lose their whatever. They were weak, and they were fearful, and they were drunk. So they made this decision. Now, chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So now he sobered up, and he's like, oh man, what did I do? I mean, she was his queen. She was beautiful. He obviously had picked her before, and so now he's lost that. And one thing about the Medes and the Persians, and this seems really dumb to me, but once the king made a law, a rule, an edict, even he couldn't undo it. So she's gone. There's nothing he can do to wind that back. He can't decide, oh, well, I didn't mean that, or okay, well, I changed my mind. He can't. So now he's stuck. He doesn't have a queen. He probably misses her. Verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered to him, let there be a fair young virgin sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather together the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, so that to the house of the women, into the custody of Hagi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things be for purification be given to them, and let the maiden which pleased the king and be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and so he did. Sorry, guys. I'm not used to wearing that, obviously. But here's another decision point. They can't bring the queen back. So what are they going to do? They're going to have, I call it a beauty pageant. They're going to have a beauty pageant where they're going to seek out all of the most beautiful virgins in the kingdom. They're going to bring him to the king. He can spend time with all of them, and then he can pick which one he wants to be the queen. Okay. All right. So as we read a little farther down, now there was in Shushan the palace was a certain Jew named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shemiel, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with captivity, that had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, who Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now this is after the 70 years had been completed, so they were allowed to go back. So there are some Jews now back in Jerusalem. They had laid the foundation of the temple. The temple was not yet built. Ezra had not yet gone. So the first 4-ish chapters of Ezra have been completed. Then Esther happens. Then you go back to the book of Ezra and complete that out when Ezra comes back. So just to give you an idea of when this is happening. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. Now Hadassah is her Jewish name. Esther is her Persian name. She goes by Esther in the book. We'll see why. Mordecai she was his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took her as her own daughter. So they're cousins, but he had raised her. So it came to pass, in the king's commandment, the decree was heard, and when the maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hagi, that Esther was brought also with the king to the king's house into the custody of Hagi, keeper of the women. Now, a beauty pageant that we know, you sort of sign up for those things. Actually, probably your parents sign you up for those things because they tend to be when they're really young, which is disturbing on its own. But she did not have a choice in this. Esther was gathered up. When you look at the way what those words mean, she didn't have a choice. She was told you're coming. You're going to be a part of this process. So if she was betrothed to somebody, if she had grown up thinking, in that culture, generally they knew kind of who they were going to marry before, when they were quite young, that's gone. Whatever her life was going to be up to that point, it is forever changed. Because the king said, you're coming. You're coming. So she was picked and she was brought to the palace. She had no choice in that matter. Okay, well, how did she react? Let's look at the next. So verse 9. And the maiden she was brought to Haggai, the keeper of the women. And verse 9, the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her the things for purification, which such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meat given to her, out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So this, if you think through, the Bible is often the best commentary on the Bible. When I read this reminds me of Joseph, who was sold into slavery. He had no choice in that matter. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, brought to be a servant in the house of Potiphar, and ended up being so productive and good that he was put over the whole house of Potiphar. Only Potiphar himself was above him. And then, of course, if you remember, he was falsely accused, thrown in prison, again, had nothing he could do about that. And in prison, decided that he was going to continue to serve and ended up being preferred by the jailer and ended up over pretty much everything in the prison except what the prison guard was responsible for. So what does this tell you? We don't have a description here of Esther's reaction. We don't have what she did necessarily. We just have the result. So we have the fruit, if you will. So when I have an apple in my hand, what tree did that come from? In children's ministry, I'm really interactive, so you guys can feel free to answer back. If I've got an apple in my hand, what tree did it come from? An apple tree. If I have an orange in my hand, it came from an orange tree. If I had a watermelon in my hand, it came from what kind of tree? A watermelon plant. Yeah, it's not a tree. All right. So we look at what the fruit is here in Joshua's life and in Esther's life. And clearly she didn't go in there and have a really bad attitude, right? She didn't go kicking and screaming. I'm sure she probably wasn't happy about this. She's basically going to be, worst case, a concubine, best case, the queen. But the chances of that, just by chance, right, if you looked at that, probably not very good. There's probably thousands of young, beautiful ladies that are going to get brought before the king. But clearly she must have been living out a godly life in order for her to have favor like that, right? Not being objectionable, not being, always me, pity party. She probably, looked at this and said, well, okay, I'm here now. I can't do anything about this. So what would God have me do? Now again, that part, speculation. We don't have what she was thinking. We don't have what she said. We only have the fruit. But when I look at this fruit, it looks very similar to Joseph's fruit. It looks very similar to other fruit that you can see. And so what does that tell you about what her attitude was? There are things in our life where things are going to happen to us, and we don't have any choice in those things. They are an event of life that is out of our control completely. Now, we can pray about those things. We can ask God to change those things. But oftentimes they happen before we even know they're going to happen. There's no opportunity to pray in advance. So you've heard your pastor say, well, you're here now. Whether you had a choice or not, this is the circumstance you are now in your life. Even if you had a choice, you cannot go backwards and change that. So you're here now. So what are you going to do now and going forward? And one of the things that I had to learn, and this was thankfully probably at least a decade ago, but I had a phrase I would tell myself: I can't change my circumstances, but I can change my attitude. So I can't change where I am right now. Maybe I can work on things, I can make things, pray about something, I can maybe work on parts of things to make the future different. But right now, here's where I am. What kind of an attitude am I going to have? Am I going to be upset and angry and lash out at people, or just sit in a pity party? Or am I going to say, okay, well, clearly God knew I was going to be here, so what does he want me to do? What does the Bible say I should do? What is it that I'm supposed to do in this situation right now? I think that's what Esther did. What else is she going to do? She can't get out of the situation. Now, Esther had not shown her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. So she was not known as, oh, well, there's Esther the Jew. There's Esther. And she's not lying. She's just not saying anything. Now, again, Mordecai told her, don't say you're a Jew. Just use your Persian name and do that. And this is a decision point. She could have listened to him or not. She chose to listen to him. So that counsel came from a godly person who has her best interest in mind. Haggai, who we're going to see here, is going to help her with her preparation. He's already done all of this. And as we go down here, and I'm just conscious of time, it's her time. They get about a year to prepare. I don't know how do you interact with a king? I'm sure she never in her life probably thought she would be interacting directly with a king. So how do you do that? So over the course of a year, she learns that. It's her turn now to go in to be with the king. And the process is, you go in and you spend the day or the night, and then the night with them. And in the morning, then you get to leave. And if he picks you, well, then you're queen. But if he doesn't, which is probably the case, then you're going to go and you're going to be with the concubines for the rest of your life. You're king's concubine now. And you will never come out of that house of concubines unless the king happens to call you. So that's your life. So she goes, it's her turn to come up. Verse 15, now, the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of whoever she is. She had taken for daughter, was come, and it was time for her to go into the king. And she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into the house of his house royal in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tithbeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So she asked and relied on Haggai, what do I take with me? Now, who would know better what the king is looking for than the person who the king pointed over all these women to make them into what he's looking for? So she chose, in her decision, what to take with her. She chose, I'm going to ask Haggai. He is not a godly man, probably. There's no indication here that he is. But he is somebody who would know and has her best interest in mind. He's already shown that. He's given her favor. He's offered her special things. They have a relationship. So she looks for that wisdom. And he tells her, here's the things you bring with you. Here's what you do. And she found favor in everybody that saw her Verse 17, and the king loved Esther above all the women and obtained grace. She obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then the king made a great feast unto all the princes and the servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts and according to the estate of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gates. Now, Esther is made queen. Think, you got 127 provinces. How many young, beautiful women were brought to the king? And she waited at least a year, so every night the king's going on a date. Must be nice to be the king. But, he picks her that night above everybody else. That's a God thing. God appointed that. We'll find out later, why. But now it says that Mordecai was sitting in the gates. So gates of the city, when you hear city gates or gates, those are the areas, we just think of doors. They were doors, but that's where a lot of the government happened. So if you think about the capital, Mordecai was in the capital. That'll give you a better understanding of what this means. So Mordecai is part of the government somehow. I don't know what his role is exactly, but somehow he's part of the government. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like when she was brought up with him. So again, she's following that wise counsel. In the days of Mordecai, while he sat at the gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, came, who kept the door. They were wroth with the king and sought to lay hands on him. And the thing was known to Mordecai, and he told it to Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof and in Mordecai's name. So she informs the king of this plot to assassinate him that Mordecai discovered. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, and therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, in those days, a lot of kingdoms, you would have chronicles. Things that happened during the kingdom, during the history of each king, they would write them down so there would be record of it. In fact, when you read through Chronicles and Kings, that's exactly what that is. These are chronicles and history of each of the kings of the northern and the southern tribes. And so when you're reading those were probably prepared originally as part of the documenting Israel's history. And so that's what happened here too. Mordecai's information and how this all went down were written down in that. This is speculation, again, by me, but I think that's where the book of Esther comes from. I think this was all written down in part of that chronicling of what happened that was probably part of the Persian kingdom, and this is what we have. And that's probably, again, speculation, but probably why God's name isn't mentioned in it, because it's part of chronicling a pagan's kingdom's history. But you take that for what it's worth. So I'm gonna summarize a little bit. After this, there's a man named Haman who comes, and he is appointed the second to the king. How he got there is unclear, but he was appointed second unto the king. And there was a decree made that everybody, when Haman came through, had to bow down. Mordecai refuses to bow down. Why? Again, I wish there was more here. It doesn't say. It has something to do, however, with the fact that he's a Jew. It says, now it came to pass as they spake daily with him. This is the people around are noticing Mordecai's not bowing. He's the only one. They spake daily to him, and he hearkened not unto them that told, and so they went and told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matter would stand. So they're like, look, Haman, I don't know if you're aware, but this one Jewish guy, he won't He won't bow down to you. And here's the key why I think this is important. For he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, he had told Esther not to say anything. But here, why aren't you bowing down, Mordecai? And it has something to do with the fact that he's a Jew. What does that mean? Well, I don't know exactly, but I know the last time I saw people that wouldn't bow down, it was Hananiah and his friends. You guys know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They were commanded by Nebuchadnezzar to bow down to an idol, and they wouldn't do it. He said, well, we're not going to bow down, right? We'll follow all your laws, but we're not going to break our commandments to God by bowing down to your idol. Sorry. And he says, well, then you'll be punished. Okay, well, if God brings us through it, that's great. If not, we're still not going to bow down. Was it something to do with that? It had something to do with idolatry. By bowing down, you were acknowledging some false god somehow. Again, my speculation, but I think that's why. Because it points out that part of the justification why he's not bowing down is because he's a Jew. Well, this bothered Haman incredibly. Just everybody bows down to me, everything's going great, but that one guy won't bow down to me. And that's all he can fixate on, is the one guy. So he decides, you know what? I'm going to get that Mordecai. No, I know what I'm going to do. I'm not just going to get Mordecai. I'm going to get all them Jews. And I'm going to get them everywhere in the whole kingdom. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So he goes to the king and he manipulates the king, and he gets an edict prepared by the king that on a certain day, and the day was chosen by rolling dice or lots, which in the Persian language is called pur. So they roll the pur, they roll the dice, and it comes up on some date that's almost a year away. On that date, all the people of the kingdom can attack the Jews and take their stuff. And it goes out. Now, what do we know about the laws of the Persians and all of them? You can't change it. So now, this law is out there, and Haman's feeling really good about this, and Mordecai's and all of the Jews are lamenting, and they're fasting, and it doesn't say praying, but if you're going to fast, you would pray. Again, you have to kind of look at that. Tells Esther, and Esther says, well, what are we going to do? Mordecai says, well, I think you should go tell the king. She goes, I haven't been called in a month, and if I go in there and he doesn't, move the scepter towards me, I'm dead. And he says, well, God's going to save us somehow, because we know God's promises. The Jewish people are going to continue, so we know that's going to happen, but it's probably going to be curtains for you, and you particularly, but maybe this is why God has you as queen. You didn't have a choice, and you found favor, and now you're the queen. Maybe this is God's plan, that you would have access to the king, where I don't have access and nobody else does. So she says, all right, fine, you guys go and fast for me, and in 3 days I'll go in. So she does. She goes in. She finds favor. She invites the king and Haman to a meal, and they have a great time, and the king says, what do you want? And she says, just come back for another meal. So they come back for another meal. Haman's like on top of the world. This is amazing. This is so cool. I mean, only me and the king. And then the king can't sleep, so he goes and he finds, he has somebody read him the history, right? So somebody's going to read him this boring history. Maybe that'll help me go to sleep. So they happen to read the part about Mordecai. Again, God weaving this through to work in the heart of a king. Reads the part about Mordecai, and the king goes, hey, what did we ever do for that guy? Nothing. What? The guy saved my life. We didn't do anything? Nope. Okay, well, I wonder what we should do. And knock, 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 here's Haman. Oh, hey, Haman, come on in. Hey, what do we do for a guy that the king just loves to honor? I mean, I really want to honor this guy. And Haman's thinking, he's talking about me. Who else could he be talking about? Oh, I think you should parade the guy through the streets, and you should put him on your horse and array him in your stuff, and you should have some guy go ahead saying, here's what we do for somebody who the king wants to honor.
And the king goes, oh, that's a great idea. Go do that for Mordecai. And right then, you could hear in Haman's mind, he's going, dum, dum, dum. You know, the jig is up. Oh, this is bad news. So Haman had to do it. He went out, he did all this, and after he's done, he's like covering his face, and he's going home, and he tells his wife, and she's like, oh, this is not. And he doesn't even have time to really process this, and he's back with the queen and the king and her thing, and she reveals to the king, look, I want, the king says, what do you want? She says, I want our lives. Me and all of my people. Because we're going to be killed. He goes, who's going to kill you? This guy, Haman, right here. And the king got so mad he left, and Haman's in there, and he's on her bed, and or couch or chair, whatever, and he's like begging, and the king comes back in and is like, oh, really? You're going to do this to my queen right in front of me? So he goes, and Haman had prepared this big gallows to hang Mordecai on. And the king says, oh, I think Haman should be hung on his own gallows there. So he did. Now, all of this to show God works in the heart of kings. We have kings over us now that are just as godless, that are just as pagan, and that are doing their own thing. And this really bothers me. But I look at the scripture and I see how God works. It's his purpose. He's going to accomplish it. Sorry, I don't like that thing. He's going to accomplish his purpose. Through kings that don't believe in him or don't want to follow him, he's going to do it anyway. And we have people who are put into positions that they don't like, they don't want, they have no control over. Well, what are you going to do? You're there. Maybe God's got a purpose for you being there. This thing that you hate, this circumstance that you can't stand, why don't you look for God's purpose in that? Change your attitude. You can't change that circumstance, but you can change your attitude by how you're going to respond to it. Let's go back to Philippians. And I would say on top of that, while you're going to Philippians, look at who you take counsel from. Are they godly? Are they truly wise? Are they pointing you in a direction that's aligned with what you know God's will is? Or are they telling you what you want to hear? Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. That word rejoice, it says be cheerful, have joy, be glad. That's your outlook on life and circumstances. That is a command. It says rejoice in the Lord, and again I say rejoice. It doesn't say feel good. That's a result. Emotions are the result of having done an action, right? Or sometimes having an action done to you. But if you do what you're supposed to, then the appropriate emotions are going to follow. So here, rejoice. Be happy. We live in the best time that has ever been for human history. The things you have that you don't even think about, hot water that you could drink when it's cold, but you have water that comes into your house that you can drink. It's hot. You can take a shower. You have food in your refrigerator. You have a way to get from one place to another. Ahasuerus didn't probably have half of that. Indoor plumbing, right? Refrigeration. He didn't have that stuff. We just take that for granted. The poorest in America are richer than most of the people on this planet. And the people on this planet today have it, by and large, better than ever in human history. And yet, we are upset. We don't have what we want. We're not content. One of the things that's helped me a lot is contentment with godliness is great gain. It is. If you are living a godly life and you can be content with what you have, your outlook on life will be so much better than always striving for and looking at what you don't have, what you didn't get, all the things that has happened to you. You can't change any of that.
All you can change is where you're at today with your attitude and where you're going to go. At work, my job has had a lot of changes since I've been there, but over the last few years particularly, a lot of changes. And a lot of people I work with are going through those changes, and you can tell it's taking a toll. It's a lot of stress. There's a lot of people that are really struggling on a daily basis with all the things that are happening. You know, this last week, I got a new boss. Now I get to train in a new boss. You know, I look at that as an opportunity. When I'm talking with people, they're always like, "You're always so happy." And I'm like, well, number one, thank you, because I wasn't always that way. But number two, I look at what I have. I look at where we can go. I'm not concerned about what has happened, because I can't do anything about that. And I look at what we have and where we can go, and that makes me happy. And then I can get busy trying to make that happen. You know, I phrase it this way too for people. I look at a glass half full. I have half a glass of water. I don't look at it half empty like, oh man, half my water's already gone. No, it's, look at what I have. If you read through, and we're going to run out of time here, but Philippians chapter 4, that chapter, if you can start plugging into that, look at that, study what those words mean, what we're called to do, and the things that we have. If your life totally stinks right now, you still have salvation. This is temporary, very temporary. No matter how, if you live to be 100 years old, that's nothing compared to eternity. And you will, for eternity, if you are saved, be in the best place with God himself, in perfect love, in a place that's meant for you, in a body that doesn't hurt and doesn't get old. Now that I'm older and getting hurt, that means a lot more than it did when I was 25. All right? But that's what you have now, not just in eternity. You have that now. Your relationship with God is now. Can you be content with that? With what he's given you? Or do you look and you're always unhappy because you don't have, or you didn't get, or this thing happened to you? And a lot of bad things can happen, but how are you going to serve God's purpose in that? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for this message. I pray it was clear. There's so much here, Lord. I just pray that you spoke through me. I just pray for myself too, Lord. Help me to be content with you and what you've given me, and look for what you have in my circumstances, that I can truly live out the joyous life that you have for me. In Jesus' name, amen.